Well, hey there, church. We are starting a brand new month here, November, and with a new month comes a new virtue of the month. We're on a journey together here to try and build our character and develop virtues in our life to help us to be able to handle all the craziness of life that comes our way. So, this month's virtue is hospitality. You know, in a world often marked by division and self interest, the practice of hospitality stands as a powerful virtue and example to God's love and grace. Jesus modeled hospitality beautifully in how he slowed down, how he noticed other people, how he showed kindness, and how that he was really open-handed and invitational. And all throughout Scripture, we're instructed and encouraged of the importance of welcoming others, not just as a way of practicing manners, but as a spiritual discipline that reflects the heart of God and really builds our character. So, in a world where we're so connected electronically or digitally, we've never been more disconnected relationally, and we all know that. So, hospitality is a beautiful and a practical pathway. So, next week we'll have more to say about this. But, boy, I would just encourage you to look onto our website and see some of our resources that we have available to you in developing this virtue in your life. Well, we are continuing our overall series of the Sermon on the Mount, but we're starting a brand new series today inside of that, and it's called Tables. And we're calling that Tables because, Thanksgiving is this month, and but also so much is done around the table when it comes to our relationships. And Jesus found himself around tables a lot as well. But the Sermon on the Mount, man, it is so relevant to us today. It is really the genius of Jesus, the greatest sermon ever preached by the greatest person who ever lived. And you guys, with all of our technological and societal advances, we still struggle with the stuff of life, don't we? We struggle with revenge, retaliation. We love our money too much, and we all deal with relational brokenness on a lot of different levels. So this sermon by Jesus has never been more relevant than it is today. You know, one of those things that we all struggle with in some form or another is something that Jesus talks about in this sermon, and that's anger. Now, it's no surprise to you that this next week, it's going to be Election Day, another presidential election. And we all know politics is really not an emotionally neutral topic, is it? It has a way to just exercise people. It has the power to divide us instead of bringing us together. And as we navigate this week, we all have two choices. We can pour gasoline, which results in more hurt, frustration, and fear, or we can pour water and help bring the temperature down and diffuse some anger. You know, according to a poll taken before the pandemic, before COVID, 84% of people think that Americans are angrier than they were a generation before. And 42% admitted that they themselves were angrier. And I would believe that these numbers are just higher since COVID. You know, anger's on the rise these days. And I think it is because uncertainty's on the rise these days. So I want to ask you a question. Do you struggle with anger? How often do you yell at other drivers on the highway? Or how often do you complain about food at a restaurant? Or when you're in the express line, you know, do you kind of measure against things? You get frustrated because things aren't moving fast enough? Never mind airports as well, right? So on a scale of 1 to 10, where would those who are closest to you, where would they land on grading you on your level of anger in your life? Now, you might think, I'm pretty good. It's no big deal for me. Or you might even be saying to yourself right now, Andy, if you saw my life and all the stressors in my life, you'd understand why I'm a little on edge. But here's what I want to get at. All the research points us to the fact that anger, especially if it's out of control, it just isn't good for you. It's not good for you personally. It's not good for our society. So let's talk about it personally for a second. For instance, when it comes to your own personal health, researchers tell us that people who are just living with this anger and are just ready to roll at any time with that, they are 3 times more likely to have a stroke. they're 19% more likely to have heart disease. And they also found out that having this anger really weakens the immune system. And they even learned that 2 hours after an outburst of anger, your chance of having a heart attack actually doubles. I mean, this is incredible research. Now, and we all know the relational effects of out of control anger. It's hard on marriages. Parents and kids, family relationships are tough. Friendships even struggle with this. People, not all, but some who are alone have admitted to anger being a problem in our lives, and it's left them in a very tough situation. And then never mind our stories of our lives and all the way that we kind of react to scenarios. They've all been affected, right? By many of us, by people that we grew up in with maybe angry homes, an angry parent or an angry sibling. And it's just caused us to live with a certain level of anxiety or, concern in our life that just kind of, we have to manage. Think about it. People have lost jobs in moments of uncontrolled anger, and the list goes on. I just could talk about this for a long time, but I won't. Now, Proverbs 15:18 says, a hot-tempered person stirs up conflict. And there's a lot of conflict these days, right? But the one who's patient calms a quarrel. So it's interesting that this writer ties the hot-temperedness to conflict. And really, this puts us on a difficult road in our life, right? Because it all begins kind of with conflict. Anger, it begins with conflict. Conflict leads to just like this increased stress. No wonder we're talking about health relationships with this. But stress in its ultimate form, if left unchecked, can lead obviously to death. And of course, the extreme is physical death, but it also leads to death of relationships, death of the future with your company. If you do something crazy because you're upset, there's all kinds of deaths in your life related to this. So the long and the short of it is this: anger is killing you. It could really do that if it's left, undealt with. Now, there's also a lot of common myths related to anger, and this is what makes it a little complex. And one of them is other people or things are the sources of my anger. It's them. It's because of them. They bring out the worst in me. And this person is so irritating and they make me so mad. Yet the truth is, and this is so freeing, you're responsible for your own level of anger. I mean, for instance, do you ever see somebody who's in a fight and then an important phone call happens and the phone rings and they have to stop the fight and then they answer the phone in a whole different manner than when they were just speaking to somebody? It tells us that we have more control in this situation than we think. It reminds me of what the writer of Proverbs says: fools vent their anger, but wise quietly hold it back. It doesn't mean they never get angry, but they have a better handle on their anger. And here's the second myth. We think sometimes that quiet people are less angry. And nothing could be further from the truth. We all think of, when we think of anger, we think of the person we know who's like the volcano, who spews and hollers and gets red-faced and does all that. But honestly, guys, most people are the ones who are the quieter ones, who kind of sit and stew a little bit. And they're quietly simmering, roiling, bubbling, right? And they sit and they ruminate on it. And it leads to a lot of bitterness. They have these arguments in their mind, and they're always battling with that. And you can see it on them. And you kind of ask them, hey, what's the matter? And their answer, of course, is, oh, nothing. But you're kind of like, no, there's something going on there. So what does Jesus say to all of this? Because to be human is to be angry at times. And Jesus himself was angry at times. So we all want to hear his take on this. So in Matthew 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about anger in verse 21. He says, you've heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder. If you commit murder, you're subject to judgment. I mean, we all kind of know that. But I say, if you are even angry with someone, you're subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you're in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you're in danger of the fires of hell. So again, Jesus is saying, anger, especially out of control anger, leads to a lot of death. It leads to a lot of problems in our life. And, I think about this. We're all fascinated with crime dramas these days, whether it's TV shows or movies or books. And now there's podcasts that are out there. But where did all these crimes begin, right? They began in somebody's heart. And in Jesus' day, the Pharisees were all about looking good on the outside, looking good to other people. And Jesus had constant run-ins with them. And at one point, he described them as these cups that are white and clean on the outside, but if you were to look inside the cup, they're rather filthy and gross on the inside, and nobody would dare take a drink from it. And in this case, he's really saying that anger is really a form of murder in our heart. It's like it may not be a criminal felony, but it's a spiritual one, and it leads to bad things in our life. And so it's important for us to note that like Jesus isn't just raising the bar in this statement as much as he's going deeper because to the original intent of the law, because the original law was really speaking about our heart as well. It just didn't say it, but there was an intent of understanding, but that kind of had gotten lost on people, and people were just looking on the outside, measuring things the way that they could see. But Jesus wanted to get back to the heart of the matter. And there's danger. We're not living the good life when we are harboring resentment and bitterness in our hearts. I kind of said this last week. The good life is the grudge-free life, and it's available to you and it's available to me. Now, again, there's a lot of confusion related to anger and the Bible. And if we were to just back up a little bit and understand the teaching on anger, we discover that in some cases, anger isn't even a sin. How do we know this? Because Jesus was angry a number of times. Many times with the religious leaders of that day was where, you found him angry and frustrated. And we learn in Scripture that there is such a thing as righteous anger. And when we see, for instance, evidence of terrible things taking place, like sex slavery or somebody hurting someone intentionally and unnecessarily, it many times can be that call to action, that anger that comes up, says something must be done to make this right. But, what I love about Jesus, because he engaged in this, Jesus turned up at more tables than he turned over. So he had his moments of anger, but he didn't kind of sit and ruminate on those. Actually, he was more about gathering around tables than flipping them over. So Paul writes later in Ephesians 4:26, don't sin by letting anger control you. And this is it. And this is where it's so difficult. It's possible to be angry and not sin, but it's not probable because it's very hard to keep it in its proper place. So I think the more important question is, how can you and me, how can we bring the temperature down with our anger these days so that so we don't ruminate on it and it doesn't turn into something more? Well, here's one of the things that we can do. We can understand that anger is really a secondary emotion. We get confused with this because we feel like it just kind of pops out and it feels like a primary emotion. It just comes out of nowhere for us a lot of times. But it'd be helpful to think about it this way. Anger is more like a smoke detector. We've all dealt with those, those things going off at all kinds of different times, usually when you're cooking and you're trying to shut those things off, pressing a button, and it won't be quiet. And it's just so frustrating. But they're there to honestly save your life, to be good. They're indiscriminate, right? So when, there's smoke in the house and enough of it, whether it's from cooking, whether it's a candle being lit, the sensitivity of these smoke detectors, they just range. They do their job. We detect smoke and we go off. That's kind of what anger is. Anger is kind of like a smoke detector. There's already another source going on here. So the issue isn't really the detector. It's the source of the smoke, right? Now, so what's the source that anger's dealing with? Well, there's three of them. There may be more, but three of them that we can talk about today really are hurt. When somebody hurts you, when you're frustrated, kind of get angry, and when you get afraid, it kind of comes out for some of us in anger. So If you had to choose one of those three right now, which one of those resonates the most with you? Where does your anger most likely come from? Which of these is lying beneath that relative, maybe that you dread sitting next to at Thanksgiving or talking to after the election, that person? Does it come from a place of hurt, frustration? Where is it coming from for you? Like I said, maybe they hurt you in the past with their words. Maybe they frustrate you with their annoying habits or their constant political opinions. Maybe you're afraid. You're just afraid that they're going to blow up again and you don't know what to expect and you just hate that whole mess. Maybe you're angry at what's going on in the world, all these wars that are taking place, and it kind of scares you, or you're frustrated by this. And then it comes out in kind of these unhealthy ways through anger. And, you're asking that question, where does all this lead? So a natural result of frustration, hurt, or fear is that we end up thinking kind of the worst of people or the worst of situations rather than really listening to what's behind it all, right? Nobody or anything can be trusted. It reminds me of a year or so ago, I was in England, and I had the chance to visit some of the people who work in the debt office there. They're kind of like, that's like the Fed, for London and for England. And we were talking to them as pastors, and we had some great access there. It was a wonderful opportunity. And the question was raised to them, what can we do as pastors to help you in your situation? And one of the responses was, can you tell the people in your church that, we're normal people just like they are, that we're not necessarily the enemy, that we are really trying our hardest. We're trying our best to, do all this work with the interest rates to try to bring everything down, to try to be able to correct situations. And it's a really hard job. And sometimes we get it wrong. It's not intentional. And then sometimes we get it right and it's a beautiful thing. But can you just, humanize us a little bit? Because it's so easy when we're far away from something to say, oh, these guys are just out to get us. And you can tell that they've been affected by the anger of others. And honestly, when we start thinking the worst of people, it's just really no good way to live our life, right? This is the opposite of golden rule life, right? Where we want to look at people in the same way that we would want them to look at us. And so we need to reflect and really detect, where's this anger coming from? And I love that James comes up with this in James 4:1. He says, what's causing the quarrels and fights among you? This tension and this fighting, this conflict. Don't they come from the evil desires at war within you? He says, there's something going on inside here, whether it's frustration or hurt or fear, any of these things. What are those desires that are not being met in your life? And is it a way for you to, is there a way for you to recognize that? Maybe for you, it's just this, you feel like you need to be understood. That resonated with what I talked about with those other guys. You're like, I would love for people to just understand me and not assume things about me. So just ask yourself this question: why am I really angry right now? And maybe it's not that your child spilled something. Maybe it's that they just weren't listening to you leading up to that, and you feel a little disrespected because of that. So deal with that root cause, not the surface problem. And then a second thing we could do to bring the temperature down is maybe to just say something like this: I could be wrong. Did you ever get angry based on an assumption that you had with somebody else? You think that that employee or your child is lazy, only to find out, that they were sick. I had this happen when my kids were younger. I would just go, man, this kid just is lethargic, he's not caring. And then I found out the next day they had like 102 fever. It was just coming on. And then I felt like a horrible dad, right? Maybe at work you feel like someone's trying to get back at you for something, only to find out they weren't thinking of you at all. They're just trying to solve a problem. I'll admit it's hard to think about being wrong in the middle of an argument, especially, right? Where everything's flying. But where we can ask for God's wisdom here is so important, and the awareness of his love for you and the other person, and just really practice that golden rule living. That's the power of living with the presence of God and allowing God to renew your mind every day, to think like Jesus does, to respond like he would, so that people in situations that come into your life see, how would Jesus respond to this? How would I want people to respond to me? Guys, I would just say this, that humility goes a long way to bring the temperature down in a situation. It's really a conflict resolution superpower, and it's like pouring water on a fire. Proverbs 15:1, the writer says, a gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. So you can even just see the tone, how we talk, slowing down. So let me give you a rubric to work through to help you walk through this in your life, especially into this post-election season we're entering into. Paul writes this to a church full of people, and because they were people, they weren't always getting along. Life's complicated. And so he really was centering in on their thought life and being reflective, and especially aligning that with the heart of God in their life. So in Philippians 4:8, he says this, fix your thoughts on what is true. And we kind of talked about that earlier. You want to ask that question, is my anger or is my frustration and hurt or fear, is it founded in reality or just an assumption on my part? Then he says, make sure that your thoughts are honorable. What that means, we could ask that question, am I showing respect with my words and with my tone? Make sure they're right and pure and lovely and admirable. In other words, is what I'm thinking and prepared to say, is it worth the other person hearing? Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. In other words, will my words call people up rather than call them just out? How many times, we might want to think, are my thoughts kind of immersed in anger and anxiety when instead, as a follower of Jesus, they can really be in wonder and worship? And, I love the example of Jesus because he lived the perfect life for us. He showed us the way of how to live. But, I think in one of the most difficult moments of his life, he led the way for us in being able to still love people in the midst of wild conflict. And in this case, while he was even hanging on a cross in immense pain and in terrible suffering. And while people hurt and harassed him and humiliated him, his response throughout the whole thing was humility, grace, and forgiveness. I mean, who can forget those famous statements? Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Guys, he gave his life on the cross for us, paying the penalty of our sins. And then he rose from the dead, showing his poise and power, and offering all of us something that is in such great demand these days, and that's hope. And I'm grateful, guys, and I know you are too, that it's his kindness, not his anger, that draws us to repentance and to live a life of love toward others. So I want to just encourage you to really reflect and to think about what's going on in here. And I want you to encourage you to practice the presence of God in your life and to ask those important questions to help bring the temperature down in some of these situations, and be a blessing, be a light to those around you. So I hope that you'll do that. You'll be like Jesus. It's not always going to be easy. You're not always even going to get it perfect. But if you're leaning into it with humility, it'll go a long way. So I hope that this has encouraged you and given you a pathway to relate to others better in this season. God bless you. I love you.